we all agree, video games are pretty good. We get to be whoever we want to be, whenever we want. We can venture into beautiful new worlds, party up with friends and slay monsters, go to war, or kick back with some brain teasers. No other medium can be quite so visceral or easygoing as games can. So how do we filter through certain games to get a grasp on what kind of experiences they give us before we boot them up? Video game ratings have always been a touchy subject, particularly here in Australia. But believe it or not, there was a time when video games weren't classified, and it caused a huge mess. The most famous example comes from 1993's US Senate committee hearings on violence in video games. The 3-hour hearing had Nintendo, Sega, and other industry representatives discuss the validity of violent and other types of titillating games. The 3 games in particular that were up for debate were Night Trap, a game where the player is meant to protect young women from a campy but vicious vampire attack; Lethal Enforcers, a light gun shooter that included a peripheral gun controller called the Justifier; and Mortal Kombat, the well-known gore-fest fighting game. The issue here was without a rating system, these games were legally obtainable by children from any retailer in the US. Understandably, this caused a problem for many reasons, but the ease of access was the most obvious argument. And when you think about it, they're right. While today we're in an easy position to scoff at how primitive these games look, at the time they were considered cutting-edge technology, and Mortal Kombat and Night Trap were 2 of the first games to feature live-action humans. The debate bounced between whether the US government needed to regulate video games, or if the industry was able to regulate itself. Sega already began an initiative to create a shared classification system leading up to the hearings, but Nintendo was reluctant to work so closely with their competitor. In 1994, a separate company was formed specifically to regulate games across all platforms called the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or ESRB. This was considered the best outcome without government intervention or censorship. Back home, video games also began classification in 1994 under the government-run Office of Film and Literature Classification, or OFLC, which in 2005 became the Australian Classification Board, ACB. New Zealand's games were also classified under the OFLC and still are today. Europe's games were rated among each country's own system until a Europe-wide regulating body, the Pan-European Game Information, or PEGI, was created in 2003, and in 2002 Japan developed their own game-specific ratings board called the Computer Entertainment Rating Organization, or CERO. Japan's, Europe's, and the US's rating boards all operate within their video games industries, whereas Australia's and New Zealand's ratings come from government bodies. Whether that's a good or bad thing is a whole other discussion. Now, the ACB is constantly under fire from local games communities because of games that get refused classification. But let's take a quick look at why that is. For years, the adult classification was vetoed by various politicians for all kinds of reasons, particularly to avoid letting violent games into Australian society. The problem with this logic was that the violent games were already in Australia, and even worse was that they were even more widely available because the highest rating a game could receive was MA15+. Thankfully, enough was enough, and Australia decided to grow up. On January 1st, 2013, Australia finally received an R18+ rating for video games. This meant games could be classified on a wider spectrum of ratings to inform people of the type of content that's in the game and what age is it suitable for. The misconception here is that many people think an R18+ rating means anything above an MA15+ rating should be made restricted to adults, and bada bing bada boom, we're good. No. The R18+ classification is very descriptive about what's accepted in games and what isn't. The usual offender that leads a game being refused classification is how it treats sexual violence and/or drug use. For example, Outlast 2 was refused early this year for its depiction of implied sexual violence. The main character Blake is drugged and surrounded by humanoid creatures engaging each other sexually, while his wife Lynn screams out for him in agony from implied sexual brutality. Blake is then pushed over and also suggestively abused. The developers later removed the scene from the game, a move that affected the final cut of Outlast 2 released in all regions, and resubmitted it to the ACB, which it then passed with an R18+ rating. An example of refused classification for use of drugs in a game is 2013's State of Decay. It was RC'd due to the use of illicit drugs as a progression aspect of the game. Certain drugs would increase the player's abilities, making game progress easier. While the game could admittedly be played without the use of illicit drugs, the board stated, "This game contains drug use related to incentives or rewards and should be refused classification." The developers then modified the game to remove references to prescribed drugs and was reclassified to R18+. The technicality of how drugs are depicted is something to be aware of in relation to Australia's rating system. Classification systems aren't designed necessarily to ban violent games or allow sexually charged ones in more easily. They're designed to adhere to a code of conduct, which then informs consumers about what kind of content they can expect. Because let's face it, not everyone is buying games for themselves.
Yes!
What is it?
Grand Theft Auto 5! Yeah! Tears to my eyes!
And that's about it for this edition of Player Attack. Thanks for watching. Next week we find out how Hugh Z went from casual player to one of the world's most sought after Smite casters, as well as taking some time to check out some of my new favourite smartphone games. In the meantime, you can catch us at playerattack.com. We're on Facebook, YouTube and Twitter, and if you've got something you want to say, send us an email, mailbox@playerattack.com, or just hop on our forums. Also, if you want to support Player Attack, you can find us on Patreon and help us bring you the latest in gaming news, plus all these wonderful interviews and reviews from the world of video games. Till next week, I'm Jessica Citizen, and this is Player Attack.